you mean?
Yeah, in terms of COVID, of course.
Well, I have my own views on COVID. If you'd like them in person, I'd give them. If you want me to tell the whole audience, I'll do it. But I'm being an economist, I'm always concerned about the economic, the unseen costs of COVID, which have not been tabulated yet. So I'm really worried about it. You know, obviously the health aspects are important, but the economic aspects, I think, are equally important. I think in the long run, the unseen cost from the economy will be far more significant than the health costs of COVID. My personal opinion, but I could be wrong.
Well, we have another minute to go, Sanjeev, and we are really looking forward to hear your views.
Thank you.
So for everyone in the audience, good morning. We have Vivek Atre and Sanjiv Bhatia with us. And we go live in another 30 seconds. We're also live on YouTube, and another 15 seconds, I will start the session. So Sanjeev, Vivek, with your permission, can we start?
Sure, let's go ahead.
Excellent. So good morning. Good morning, Sanjeev, Vivek, participants, audience. It's so wonderful to have all of you here today. Welcome to the 33rd session of the Yogananda Guru series. We started the Yogananda Guru series with a promise to bring you exceptional speakers every day at 11:30. Speakers of interest, speakers who could pick up topics that we ponder about every day. And I'm delighted to introduce our speaker for the day today, Sanjiv Bhatia. I was reading Sanjeev's CV and I just couldn't end reading it because it had so many accomplishments. Sanjeev is an economist, he's a finance wizard, he's an investment banker, he's worked in senior positions in blue chip banks like Solomon Smith Barney. He's been a visiting faculty at great business schools like Darden, Columbia Business School, and the Indian School of Business. And we're so lucky to have you with us, Sanjeev. Hosting Sanjeev is going to be Vivek Atre, a very dear friend, a visiting faculty and advisor to Shoolini. You all know he's ex-IAS, TEDx, an author, and more importantly for me, a dear friend and always smiling. So Vivek, over to you to formally welcome Sanjeev. The format is going to be a couple of questions from Vivek to Sanjeev, and then Sanjeev speaks for around 30 odd minutes. He's going to talk about the economy. He's going to talk about how the world is going to be post-COVID and how India is going to be post-COVID. He'll introduce some concepts of economics to all of us, the way he looks at the world and India. And then we'll go into a Q&A. So please do not hesitate to ask any questions from Sanjeev and Vivek. Vivek, over to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Atul Khosla. Atul, it's a pleasure to be part of Shoolini's Yogananda Guru series. I follow Paramahansa Yogananda's teaching and delightful to have it named after him. Sanjiv Bhatia, thank you for joining us, Professor Bhatia. You are kind of a gold mine in our small town of Panchkula, because I know the reasons why you came back from the US because of family reasons. Otherwise, you may have been globetrotting even till today. But you're based in Panchkula. You've added a lot of value to circles in Chandigarh, Panchkula, even I believe now teaching in Bangalore and Hyderabad. So before you get into your discourse, why don't you tell us how the experience has been teaching in India vis-a-vis teaching in the US?
Oh, thank you, Vivek, and thank you, Atul, for having me on board. I've been very, very happy with the facilities at these universities. I taught at ISB Hyderabad, and then again I got an opportunity to teach at IIM Bangalore. I was very, very impressed with the facilities. It all starts with the facilities because it really shows the seriousness of the institute on a number of levels. Secondly, the faculty was very, very good in terms of interacting with them, in terms of ideas of research and just intellectually exchange. And then obviously the students. I was very, very impressed with the quality of students, both at ISB and IIM Bangalore. I mean, they were at par with any students I've taught, and I've taught for over 40 years now. So I was very, very impressed with the quality of students. So overall, I think Indian education, at least the institutes that I've been to, is at par with anything else I've been associated with. And then that's the reason why so many foreign faculties come to teach at ISB and IIM Bangalore, because they get a lot of value out of it for themselves. So yes, no question about it. No question about it. Indian education, with a little help and a little slight changes in policies, I think we could be easily very, very competitive in the world.
Yes, Sanjeev, and we must get you to teach at Shoolini as well. Atul, I'm sure, will invite you. I've been going there for a few years now, and it's wonderful to go and interact with these students. They're so bright and energetic and enthusiastic, and with exchanges of the kind that make you feel, as a teacher, more lively and peppy. So I'm sure you're going to enjoy this interaction as well. This particular session is more about the economy, and that is your forte. But just to set the ball rolling, I would also request you to focus on not only the short-term measures to be taken post-COVID, but also on the long-term measures. And, the Nobel laureates and the government often don't see eye to eye. So let's see what the great economists are advising India to do and what India is actually doing. Are they converging in their ideas, or is it a little bit of a political game? But anyway, let's see what the way forward is. And after a bit of bashing for the US and India, I'm sure you'll get on to some constructive ideas on what should be the road ahead. And I'm sure you'll be, yeah, I've heard you speak. And for the audience, I must tell you that Sanjeev knows economics like nobody else does. And it's a tribute to his kind of expertise and experience that he's not only a teacher, but he's also a very successful entrepreneur and a venture capitalist and an investment banker. Very all-rounderish in that sense, and chose to settle in India for the last few years for reasons of family. Very good to have you, Sanjeev. Over to you now for about 30 minutes of your lecture.
Thank you, Vivek. You put a lot of pressure on me by saying I'm a well-known economist. I'm not well-known, but I've done a lot of economics, been an investment banker and an economist for over 35 years. I was the head of the global investment strategy group at a firm called Solomon Smith Barney in New York. And as part of being the head of investment strategy, I had a large corpus of about $110 billion, which we had to invest in. $110 billion at that time was larger than the annual budget of India. Right. So it was a significant amount of money that we had to invest. And obviously, we couldn't invest all of that in the US. So part of what we did was we invested all over the world. And in understanding, and in that process, we also had to understand how countries work, what drives the economy of a country. And as I studied all these countries, and at any given point in time, we were looking at over maybe 70 different countries. And as we studied these countries, I began to ask myself the question: what is it that makes a country more successful? What is it that makes a country's economy more successful? Why are some countries more successful economically than others? And as we started to investigate this question, there were certain clear principles that kept popping up. And I'd like to go into those principles today at some length, because I think in order to understand India's economic policy and where we are today and where we are going, whether it's post-COVID or pre-COVID or whatever, I think it's very obvious to me that I need to first explain in a very simple terms, how an economy works. And I think it's important for people to understand that, because people think of an economy as a very complicated thing. It actually is not. It's driven on very simple principles. All right. So in order to explain that, and the problem with economics is that we, unlike physics and chemistry, we can't do any experiments in a lab. The only thing we have right now is a history, and we have to go by history. And what has worked in history is something we think may work in the future. And what has worked for most countries, we have to assume will work for India too. So let me first take a very simple example of a small island country. Okay, small island with, let's say, 5 people in that island. It's a country by itself, and you can make that into 1.3 billion people. It's not going to change much. The complexity gets a little higher, but the understanding of economics still remains the same. So let's take a small little island country with 5 people, and they make coconuts. They go climb up a tree, they cut coconuts, and they bring it down. So their gross domestic product, which is the total value of the goods and services they produce, is the number of coconuts they produce on a given day. So let's assume that each person produces 2 coconuts a day. So that, and 5 people working. So the total GDP of that country is 5 multiplied by 2 is 10. Now the question is, how do you improve the economy of this country? How do you increase the GDP of that country? Well, there's only 2 ways you can improve GDP. And this works whether it's a small island nation or it's an entire country like India or a large country like India. There's only 2 ways you can improve the GDP of a country. First is you increase the number of people in the workforce. Okay, so instead of 5 people, let's say this island nation started to tell its younger people who were not doing anything to get up and start cutting coconuts, or they allowed immigration into the island. They said, okay, here's a stowaway coming in. We'll take this fellow into the island, into our country, and let him work and produce and cut coconuts and produce GDP for the country. So let's say they add another 2 people. So the workforce goes from 5 to 7. And each person still cuts 2 coconuts. The GDP of the country goes to 7 multiplied by 2, 14. So the GDP of the country went from 10 to 14 by increasing the number of people in the workforce. And that's what's been happening in India from 47 all the way up to basically 1991. The average workforce in India was increasing by roughly about 2.5 to 2.7% on an annual basis. And our GDP was increasing by roughly 3%. So most of that increase in GDP from 47 to 1991 was coming largely from an increase in the working population. We were adding roughly 6 to 7 million people to the workforce every year. The second way you can improve an economy or improve the number of coconuts this island nation produces is by increasing the number of coconuts each person produces, which is called productivity. Okay, so let's say they now get a machine to climb the trees. Instead of taking 3 hours to climb the tree, they get a machine that allows them to climb up the tree in an hour. And now instead of 2 coconuts, each person can now produce 3 coconuts. Well, the total GDP of the country goes now from 7 people, 3 coconuts each, 21. So it went from 14 to 21. Okay, so the second way you improve an economy or improve the GDP of a country is by increasing the productivity, the number of coconuts, the number of widgets produced by each person. And that's the key to economic growth of any country, is the productivity, because most countries are sort of tied into the number of people that can come into a workforce. It has to come from productivity. And most of the gains in economic growth over the last 60 years have come from gains in productivity. And what India needs to do is all its policies need to be focused on how to improve productivity. Okay, so I just gave you an example of this island nation and how it improved its GDP or its productivity. One of the ways they did that was by using capital equipment, by using a machinery. Okay, so investment in fixed capital, investment in capital equipment is one way to improve the productivity of people. Let's also again take another example. Let's say on the other side of the island, they find some more coconut trees. Now, in order to get to the other side of the island, they need to build a road. So these people in the island, they build a road. Now they can get to the other side of the island, and each person can now in a given day harvest 5 coconuts. So suddenly the GDP of this country is now gone from 21 to 7 multiplied by 5, 35. So building roads, infrastructure allows the country's GDP to grow, the economy to grow. Okay, so a complex economy like India is still driven by these 2 fundamental factors, an increase in the workforce and an increase in productivity. Now, what we have to do is figure out what causes an increase in productivity and what causes a decrease in productivity. Now, before I get there, let me also introduce money, because it is money that drives a lot of these things, because money is an important factor of production. It's not only just labor, it's not only just number of trees, it's also money, because you need money to buy the machine, you need money to build roads. And so we add another third element, which is capital markets. The money comes from what are called capital markets. Capital markets include your banks, stock market, your bond markets, your NBFCs. All these are part of what's called the capital markets, or the financial markets, also called the credit markets. And money is an important part of what's called a transaction. Okay, you need money to do a transaction. Okay, so let's say I buy apples from you, I give you money, we've just had a transaction. My expense is suddenly become your income. Okay, so in every transaction, one person has an expense, the other person has a corresponding income. And if you add the income of all these people, that becomes the gross national product of the GDP of a country. So it stands to reason that the more transactions we do, the higher the GDP of the country would be. Okay, so now we've got a third element added a third element to GDP. First is the number of people working. Second is the number of coconuts each person produces, which is called the productivity. And third is the number of transactions, which can be done through the efficient use of capital. Okay, so capital markets have become a very, very integral part of a modern economy. Okay, it's the lifeblood of an economy is capital. Okay, and the objective of any policy decision must be twofold. Actually, you can't increase the number of people. That's a demographic thing. And India has been very fortunate demographically that we've got a lot of young people coming into the workforce. This is a very productive force that can climb up the tree and cut coconuts. What we need to do is make sure that every policy decision we make either improves productivity or increases the number of transactions, increases the efficiency with which capital is used. So so once I've set that up, you must understand that this is how simply an economy works. Okay, it is really not that complicated. It is simply number of people multiplied by the number of coconuts per person, added to that the number of transactions that are done in an economy. If there are 1 billion transactions done in an economy versus 1 million, then the 1 billion transactions will produce a higher GDP versus 1 million transactions. So the question then is, what are some of the things that we have to look at as economists to figure out whether they'll have a positive impact on productivity and the number of transactions, or a negative impact on productivity and the number of transactions? Well, earlier I mentioned to you my job as head of global investment strategy, and in that process we looked at 70 different countries and the economies of 70 different countries, and we kept asking ourselves the question, what is it that makes one country more successful economically than the other? And there were 6 things that kept popping up. And let me go through those 6 things, and I want you to think of those 6 things in the context of India. First is the size of the government. This one variable was, to us, the most critical variable that drove economic performance, the size of the government. By the size of the government, I don't mean the number of government employees, although that is also a very important factor. By size, I mean the reach of the government. How deeply is government involved in decision making? How deeply is government involved in commerce? How deeply is government involved in the economy? Is the government picking priority sectors that investments should go to, or is that being done by the free market? And we found that countries that had free capital markets, where capital was allowed to freely to the best return asset, or to that particular production which provided the best return, that was the most efficient way to do things, as opposed to a centralized system where the government had a committee or they had a planning commission which decided what the priority sectors would be. And they would say, okay, you allocate money here, you allocate money here, you allocate this much money here. That system worked for a little while, but then it was not very productive. And a good example of that is the East Asian economies. Okay, really there are 2 models to this. One is the East Asian capitalism model, and the other one is the Western capitalism model. By the East Asian capital model, I mean the capitalism model followed by countries like Japan, Korea, Singapore, Taiwan. Okay, and countries like Taiwan, for example, the government prioritized the semiconductor sector. In Singapore, the government prioritized the financial services sector. And it was a top-down driven approach where the government came up with priority sectors. And it worked fine. In Korea, it was the auto sector. And in Japan, it was the electronics sector and the auto sector. And it worked fine for a while. But eventually growth slowed down. Japan has had average GDP growth rate of 1% since 2002. 1% GDP growth since 2002. Korea has not had more than a 2% GDP growth, I think, for 1 year over the last 16, 17 years. So that form of state-driven capitalism, where decisions are made by either a planning commission or a small group of people who come up with priority sectors, doesn't work on a long-term and consistent basis. China is also a good example. China's an example of state-driven capitalism. But China's growth has not exceeded 6.5% for the last 10 years. And its stock market peaked in 2007. It's gone down 50% since 2007. And Chinese banks are in trouble, and Chinese companies have huge amounts of debt. So China is not a great example of the success of state-driven capitalism. On the other hand, we have Western capitalism, which is free market capitalism. which is the model followed in the United States. The government of the United States does not own a single company, does not run a single company other than Amtrak and maybe the United States Postal Service. Everything is run by the private sector. And that's something that India needs to understand. In India, a large number of companies, I think 950 odd companies, are run by the government, either at the center or the state. And I think 80% of them are unprofitable. There are 20% of the companies, and most of them in the energy sector, where it's very hard to not make money, where they're successful. I mean, they still have a company that produces film. I don't know how many people in the audience would even remember what a film was, but in the old days, we used to take a picture with a camera, it had a film in it. And we still have a company, a government-run company in India, which spends about 700 crores a year in salaries that makes film. So it's really not a conducive way to have economic growth. Okay, certainly productivity is not enhanced by government interfering in matters of commerce. Okay. So the first thing first conclusion we came to in studying all these economies was that the larger the government, the more the government interfered, the reach of the greater the reach of the government, the less likely it was that the economy would be successful and prosperous over a long period of time on a sustainable basis. And that is something that India needs to be mindful of. And in 2013 elections, Mr. Modi said, I think he said something like minimum government and maximum governance. And I was very, very happy when I heard that. Minimum government meant small government and maximum governance. And I was very happy to hear that. Unfortunately, it hasn't quite carried through. The rhetoric hasn't turned into policy, but it is certainly, the direction was there. Okay, and I hope and pray that he comes back to that minimum government principle that he enunciated in 2013. The second thing we looked at was that countries that had successful economies had a strong rule of law, which was applied equally across the board. And it's a very, very important thing to understand. And I wrote an article where I said that people are guided by two things. It's either shame or guilt. And there's something called the 1 a.m. test. And the studies done by a Swedish university. They went to 100 different countries and they looked at what people do at 1 a.m. At a traffic light at 1 a.m. in the morning. And they found that in India, 90% of the people, it's close to actually 92% of the people, never stopped at the traffic light or even when it was red at 1 a.m. in the morning, because they knew that the chances of getting caught were small and significant. So they never stopped. It was not whether it was right or wrong. It was more driven by the fact whether they'd get caught or not. Now, the same study showed that in Sweden, the number was 2%. So 98% of the people stopped at a red light, even at 1 a.m. in the morning, because they knew that was the right thing to do. Okay, so the rule of law is very important in driving economic performance. How contracts are followed and the enforcement of contracts as part of rule of law is very, very important. In India, it takes roughly 4.5 to 5 years, based on some studies that I've seen and read, for a contract to be enforced. Now, it's very difficult to have productivity growth. It's very difficult to have a person cutting 4 coconuts instead of 2 if he's going to have contract problems regarding the sale of his coconuts, and he's going to spend all his time fighting his case in court. So that's important. The third thing is the equality in which the rule of law is enforced. Okay, we keep talking about inequality of income in India, but we never talk about inequality of justice. In the United States, for example, a country where I spent 35 years, it doesn't matter whether you're the governor of a state or the vice president. The president has some exemptions, so let's leave him out. But even the most senior person goes to jail if they violate the law. In India, I doubt if you can find more than 1 or 2 politicians that have gone to jail in the last 25, 30 years, even though we all know that there's a fair amount of breaking the law in many different cases. So the rule of law is not equally applied. And I was talking to a lawyer friend of mine who does a fair amount of research in this area. He told me 70% of the people in jail right now are what they call under trials, which means people that have not been convicted yet. They have not even been tried yet. And many of these people have spent more time in jail than they would have if they had been convicted. And that's not fair. So we need to stop talking about income inequality. We need to start talking more about inequality in these areas: inequality of opportunity, inequality of justice. So rule of law is very, very important. The third thing is, we found that countries that were successful were driven more by principles and less by policies. And this is very, very important when it comes to India. We have a lot of policy driven problem solving, but there is a lack of coherent principles, with the result that we get this hodgepodge of policies, and some of them end up contradicting each other. And so they're not all pushing in the same direction. Let me give you an example of GST is a good example. I think we can all agree that GST could have been done better, but there was no clear enunciation, as far as I'm concerned, whether the purpose of GST was to increase revenue, tax revenue. Was it to simplify the tax system? Was it to equalize the tax across all states? Or was it to increase the tax base? There was no clear enunciation of principles, with the result that we got this hodgepodge of policies put together, and which made GST very complicated, and with the result that it's not been as effective as it was intended to be, and as it has been in so many different countries. So we need to stop being driven by policies. When you ask people to solve a problem, 100 people will come up with 100 different solutions. But if you enunciate a set of principles for them, you can narrow down the feasible solutions to a few. So we need to do that. I think the leadership of India needs to enunciate a set of principles and say, this is what is going to drive the country. For all his mistakes, Nehru was pretty clear. He said, we're going to have a model of socialism. Okay, right or wrong. To me, he was obviously wrong. But he was clear what he wanted to do. He wanted to follow a model of socialism, which unfortunately didn't work. So the fourth thing we found was regulation. Countries that have excessive regulations tend to have lower economic growth than countries that have fewer regulations. And I think we can all agree, everybody listening to me can all agree, that India is way over-regulated. We have too much bureaucracy and too much red tape. And I wish if Mr. Modi came to me and said, give me one suggestion, I would say start a ministry of deregulation. Take 90% of the existing regulations, throw them out of the window. They are totally redundant. They are complex. And they don't solve problems. They've been added on top of each other just to avoid the loopholes from the existing regulations. So what we need is a ministry of deregulation run by judges and business people, and eliminate 90% of the regulation. It will really simplify the way things of the ease of doing business in India. And when business has fewer regulations to follow, its productivity goes up. So back to, again, more coconuts per person. You want to increase productivity, limit the size of the government, have principles and less fewer policies, the rule of law, and deregulation. And then finally, I think we also found that countries that were successful were driven by ideas and innovation. And we need to focus on ideas and innovation. And I've got a statistic here that'll absolutely boggle your mind. The 5 companies in the US called the FAGMA companies, Facebook, Apple, Google, Microsoft, and Amazon. Last year, they spent $80 billion on R&D. And all of India, which includes all the private companies and all the governments, state and central government, spent only $15 billion. So 5 companies in the US spent 5.5 times more than the entire country of India on research and development. Okay, no country can grow its economy without innovation and without new ideas. And India needs to start really ramping up its research and development. And I'm very, very happy to hear talking to Atul earlier about Shoolini and how much they emphasize research, and 50% of their student body is PhD students. So we need to start pushing R&D across the country. And instead of CSR, I wish the government would have some sort of a incentive for companies, or some minimum requirement of, let's say, 5% of their corpus should be spent on R&D. Another favorite peeve of mine is government tenders. The government controls a vast amount of resources, and all the roads and bridges and everything's done by the government. And in the tendering process, it's always, the focus is always on L1, which is the least cost tenderer. There is never much focus on the most innovative company. And there are always very stringent requirements on minimum balance sheet for the companies that can qualify. Small innovative companies don't have that track record or that balance sheet to qualify for most of these government tenders, with the result that they just remain either very small or they just die down. So the government has to create some incentive for companies to do R&D. I was very complimentary of Mr. Modi's efforts with Startup India. In fact, I was there in Delhi when we gave a speech on Startup India. I wish there was more incentives given for startup in India. We have to follow up rhetoric with policy, you know. And then lastly, I think the role of free markets is very important. Countries that have successful economies have free markets. Okay, now what is a free market? There is no better example. I think India is the prime example of free markets. Okay, all the 70 to 80% of Indian business comes in the informal sector. Okay, how does the informal sector work? Somebody starts construction somewhere, a brick bhatta comes up next door. A guy starts selling tea and samosas to all the laborers that work in that particular building complex. Okay, these people are setting up industry based on the demand and the need for products and services. There is no central government authority guiding their decision making. It's all done based on the principles of free markets. Chandni Chowk, I don't know how many been to Chandni Chowk, is a prime example. The largest flea market in the world, where must be billions of dollars of business done in a given day, is a prime example of free market. Shopkeepers know what to get based on demand. Buyers know what to buy based on prices. Nobody's there guiding anybody. Ke bhi tum itna stock rakho, you keep this in stock, that much in stock. It's all done by the free market. And so India should be run on the basis of free market rather than the government dictating things, and especially in terms of priorities and all that kind of stuff. One of the things that surprised me, the first people asked me what surprised you the most about India was the emphasis people place on the national budget. The budget, the day the budget is announced in India is more important than Diwali and Holi and all these festivals. It's like a religious thing. I mean, all the newspapers are taking every little statement made by the finance minister and parsing it in 15,000 different ways. In the US, the day the budget is announced, nobody even knows the budget has been announced because the government is really not that big a deal in terms of their involvement in commerce and economics. But in India, since the government is so deeply involved in commerce and economics, the budget has become a significant thing. So one of the things that the government has to do is clearly enunciate ways in which it will improve productivity. Smaller government, smaller regulations, rule of law, free markets, and then obviously emphasis on education and skill development. India's roughly government expenditure on education is very measly compared to a country the size of India and country at the stage of India's development. We need to double, or at least double, if not triple, India's expenditure on R&D. And unfortunately, with this COVID virus, so much of the resources are going to go to rehabilitating companies, and a lot of that money is going to have to come from other sources. You know, you can't give to one person what you first don't take from somebody else. So where will that money come from? That money will come from education, from healthcare, and some of these other things. You know, the governments are going to have to run large deficits to support those programs. So education is very important to increase productivity. Infrastructure is very important to increase productivity. We need to build that road to the other side of the island so we can grab more coconuts per person. So everything that you look at in terms of government policy, you should look at in terms of, does it enhance productivity and does it increase the number of transactions? And lastly, the last thing that I want to emphasize is capital markets. India's capital markets are very weak. Okay, I've worked with capital markets for a good part of my life, and I've seen strong and stable capital markets. Capital markets have to be the backbone of the economy. In India, 70% of the of banks are owned by the government, which means 70% of the assets, financial assets of the country, are owned and run by the government. In the United States, guess how many banks are run by the government? Zero. No bank run by the government. Everything is run by the private sector. So the allocation of resources is done on the basis of efficiency. Sunrise industries get allocated capital. Industries that are not doing well, they stop getting capital. I mean, if you go down the list of companies that are in the top 100 currently in the US, and you look at this companies that were in the top 100 10 years ago, I bet you wouldn't find more than 3 or 4 companies that are similar. In India, it's the same set of companies year in and year after. Also in terms of people, the same families that ran Indian businesses over the last 40 years are the same families that are still running Indian business. In America, there's new people coming every year. Zuckerberg this year, and somebody else another year. It's just new ideas, new innovative ideas, and efficient allocation of capital. So India needs to really ramp up its capital markets, and I think the government needs to seriously think about getting together a bunch of experts who understand capital markets and putting together a set of principles that will guide India's capital markets going forward. India's stock markets, India's bond market, India's banking sector. And just to give you an example of how important capital markets are, India's banks currently have about 9% NPAs, bad loans, non-performing assets. By most accounts, that is likely to double in the next 6 months. Okay, as a lot of companies are going to go bankrupt, that number might double. Okay, I personally don't think it's going to double, but certainly will go to 14-15%. That is a huge amount of NPAs. Now, why is the bank always taking the risk? And by banks, I mean the taxpayer, because most of these banks are public sector banks. So eventually the taxpayer has to bail these banks out. Why is it that the banks or the taxpayer is bearing all the risk? That's the role of capital markets. The role of capital markets is to allocate risk to those who can bear it, and to allocate resources to the most efficient use of capital. So we need strong and efficient capital markets. So having said that, I've given you a basic idea of what it is that it takes to drive an economy very simply. It's productivity and increase in the number of transactions, which comes from the capital side. How do we do that? I've given you a set of 6 different things we need to look at. And it has to be driven by policy principles rather than just putting together a scheme here or a scheme there, or solving a problem here and solving a problem there. Because when you solve one problem, you create a problem somewhere else. Okay, and the economy is a very complex ecosystem. There are millions of stakeholders. If you give a loan if you waive off the loan for a farmer, that money has to come from the taxpayer. So you benefit one group, but you take the money from another group. So in a complex ecosystem like that, cannot be run centrally by a committee in the government. It has to be run on the basis of free markets. There is no other way to do it. And the success of free markets is so obvious that it's not even debatable anymore. I think there is one thing that all economists can agree on, is that free markets and economic freedom are the basis on which economies should be structured. And so having said that, let me also go to sort of the pre-COVID and the post-COVID economic situation in India. And let me first go to pre-COVID, because I think it's important to set up the Indian economy pre-COVID, and then we'll go to post-COVID. The Indian economy wasn't doing very well pre-COVID. I think everybody knows that the growth rate, GDP rate, had fallen to roughly about 3.5% from what it was about 8% in 2015. And I wrote an article in which I compared the decade of 2000 to 2010 to the decade of 2010 to 2019. And the difference between that first decade, 2000 to 2010, and the second decade, which is 2010 to 2019, was very stark. And I called it the lost decade. And on almost every economic parameter and every social parameter, I found that the decade from 2000 to 2010 was significantly better for the country than the decade from 2010 to 2019. And it has nothing to do with politics, because there was both a Congress regime from 2010 to 2014 and a BJP regime afterwards. It had nothing to do with politics. It's simply to do with reforms. In 1991, the country reformed. And most of you remember, I don't know how old some of you are, if you remember the 70s. I grew up in the 70s. In the 70s, we had 2 of everything, as a joke a friend of mine has. We had 2 of everything. We had 2 cars, Fiat and Ambassador. We had 2 scooters, Lambretta and Vespa. We had 2 soaps, Lux and Hammam. We had 2 cooking oils, Rath and Dalda. 2 motorcycles, Bullet and Yezdi. We didn't have a lot of consumer choice. And it was only in 1991, when the economy was opened, that we started getting more consumer choice. But what happens is then, when it increases consumer choice, it also forces the manufacturing or the production of these things. And so Indian production started to improve. And initially it took a little while for people to get used to those reforms, but I think from 2000 to 2010 was really good age for India. Our economy grew at an average rate of 7.7% a year, and I mean, in the decade after 2010, it's grown at roughly what, about 5.6%. Now the difference of 7.7 and 5.6, 2.1% is huge. If you extrapolate India's GDP, which is roughly about $2.5 trillion, and you factor in that 2.1% growth over the last 10 years, we're looking at almost $1 trillion of lost growth. So we've got to come back. We've got to come back to the principles that created success from 1991. And what are the principles that created success from 1991? Opening the economy up, not closing it, opening the economy up. And by opening the economy up, I don't mean just opening it to foreign trade. I also mean opening up our currency, okay, which has been a pet peeve of mine. It is very difficult to induce a foreign company to come invest in India if we don't open up a channel for them to take their money out. Okay, in India currently there's controls on capital. Okay, so capital meaning investments in plants and equipment. There is a restriction on how much can be taken in and out, and that has to completely be stopped. Okay, India has significant amount of reserves, $530 billion in reserves. Okay, so it's not like 1991 where we had $6 billion in reserves. We have significant amount of reserves, so there's no reason to have any control on currency. Let the currency flow in and out freely, and you will suddenly find people borrowing in foreign markets, foreign companies coming to India because they know they can take their money out whenever they want. They'll invest without any risk, without that added risk of currency control. So that'll have a significant impact on economic growth and productivity. It'll increase the number of transactions. So having said that, India's economy was in trouble before COVID. Now it's in deep trouble. And I was totally shocked yesterday when I heard the commentators applauding the size of the package. And some people even put up a statistic that, oh, it's 10% of the GDP and that puts India fifth, as if it was some achievement. I mean, the size of the package to me only indicates how horribly things have gone, you know. And there is no free lunch. The money is not just going to drop from the air. Okay, like I said earlier, what you give to one person has to be first taken from somebody else. So where is this money going to come from? 20 lakh crores is almost the annual budget of India. I'm on 2/3 of the annual budget of India. What the government collects all year round from taxes in a normal economy is now going to have to be collected from a poor economy. It's not going to happen from taxes. So where's the money going to come from? The money is going to come from either borrowing, or it's going to have to come from printing new money. Both of them entail risks. I don't know how many of you look at the budget, but roughly 18% of India's annual budget goes in paying the interest cost of existing debt, central and state debt. 18%. Now, if you suddenly double that amount, you know, you're going to end up paying roughly a quarter of your annual budget in just interest costs, which leaves, the more you pay in interest costs, the less money you have left for other things like education and healthcare. And so those are things that we have to be very mindful of. And I can answer questions in a question and answer session if you want, Vivek. So what I've tried to do in these 15-20 minutes is give you a very, very basic understanding of economics, so that you understand that economics is really not as complicated and complex as people make it out to be. The numbers don't mean much as long as you understand the basics. And the basics are what can improve productivity and what can increase the number of transactions. And it's capital and capital markets that drive the whole thing, and they're very important. And free markets allow people to allocate capital more efficiently than an economy which is driven by a body like the government. So Vivek, if you have questions or a direction you want me to go in, I'd be happy to address that.
Atul is going to first say a few words. Yes, Atul.
Absolutely a stunning lecture, Sanjeev. You made economics sound so simple. So my pitch to Sanjeev was that my mother is going to be there on the lecture, and if she calls me back and said "Maza aa gaya," that's your litmus test, and I think you passed the litmus test, Sanjeev. Hats off to you. Amazing, you know, the way you explained economics to all of us. So two questions for you before we go into the questions from the audience. The first is you spoke about the 2000 to 2010 regime and then 2010 to 2020. I've been a little bit of a follower of economics and a student of economics and politics. And the hypothesis the world over that we have is that coalitions are actually good for economics, while strong governments are bad for economics. So if you look at 2000 to 2010, which are the golden years, and I agree, India was actually going through a phase of coalition politics in a very sizable way. Whether it was the BJP government, Atalji's government, or it was the Congress government that came after that, they were all coalitions. So they made sensible decisions. So first, I wanted to get your views on this one. My second comment, which I really liked, was what you call free markets, or letting the market determine where to invest. And I, of course, am very selfish. I always look at the higher education market, for example. So I did some back of the envelope calculations saying that if India has to be a great economy, we have to invest very, very sizably in higher education, into research institutions. And the number is a staggering $1 trillion. So India will have to invest $1 trillion, which for everyone in terms of lakh of crores is 5 times what Modi ji has said he's going to invest today, just in higher education, if India has to compete with the West and have higher educations like that. Now, that cannot come from the government. But if you really think about it, am I audible right now?
Yes.
You're audible to me,
okay.
So I guess.
Okay. So where does this money come from? It'll have to come from free markets. It'll have to come from outside. But we cannot get this money because the trust structure and not-for-profit structure doesn't allow free capital to flow into, let's say, higher education institutions. So these are two thoughts from me. Would love your comments on both of them, and then Vivek will pick up other questions.
Well, let me answer the first one first. I have never seen any study that has correlated coalition governments with better economic progress. Okay, so I cannot take that premise as a given. Maybe it happened in India for one decade and didn't happen in the other. I don't know if there's any strong correlation between the two. In fact, if you would think that a government that is not a coalition government would be strong enough to push through a set of policies that are driven by principles. Okay, so like I said earlier, India's policy making has been, other than 1991, where a clear set of principles were enunciated. Okay, very clear set of principles were enunciated. And now back in 51, Nehru enunciated a very clear set of principles, whether we like it or not. But 1991, a clear set of principles were enunciated that we have to get away from license Raj into a free, more open economy, open to the rest of the world. I don't see that happening right now. I don't see a clear set of principles being enunciated. And I wish Mr. Modi would just come and say, look, going forward, India would be a country where the government is not going to be responsible for running every part of commerce. Okay, we don't want to control 70% of the total capital in the country. We don't want to control any banks. We don't want to run steel mills. We don't want to run coal plants. We don't want to run airlines. We don't want to run telecommunication companies. If he just made that one statement, the signal to the global market would be so strong that we would, there would be so much FDI coming into India. Right now, people are so scared of investing in India. You know, there's an opportunity for India here with this COVID crisis because people are getting a little tired of China's shenanigans and the totalitarian regime that runs China. So there is an opportunity for India to be part of this global chain, supply chain. But unfortunately, what I heard yesterday was just the opposite, where India wants to build a strong local chain instead of a global, so be part of the global supply chain. And you know, I talked about productivity earlier, productivity being a key driver of economic growth. It is free trade that improves productivity. I make better shoes, you make better shirts. You make shirts, I make shoes, we trade. That's called comparative advantage. That's what the world has been running on for the last 60 years and has greatly reduced the number of the poverty levels in the world. We need to be part of this global supply chain by being free to the world, not being closed and focusing people to buy local. I just don't agree with Mr. Modi there. I'm sorry, you know. Your second question was, I guess I think I've maybe answered both of them. I have a little bit of a life or brain last in first round. So if you want to repeat your question, I'll be happy to answer it, unless you think I've already answered it.
I think you already have. I was making a comment on free markets. saying that it's not just about industry, but free markets and capital needs to flow across the value chain, even in areas like education.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you know, if you the point I try to want to make is one of the studies we do when did on Wall Street, just we would, you know, didn't have anything to do. I told my team, I said, make a list of all the top 100 inventions in the last 200 years. They made a list of the top 100 inventions in the last 200 years. You know, 99 out of the 100 came out of universities, private universities. Only one in Russia came out of the government because Russia was so totally controlled by the government. It is the private sector that drives innovation. It is the private sector that produces goods and services. It is a myth that the government produces growth. The government does not produce growth. It is the private sector that produces the economy. And so it is for private universities. A lot of the good research and development is going on in private universities like yours, where there's a huge amount of emphasis on research and development, you know. So the private sector has to play a much more important role in India, and that will only happen if the government doesn't suck up 40% of the capital for its own purpose, leaving very little for the private sector. And the government controls through its regulatory regime how the private sector will work. I mean, everything from what time do you open, what kind of products you can sell, what kind of exports you can have, this, that. It's just the length of regulatory overreach in India is just simply very, very bothersome, and it has to change. It has to change.
Atul, if you allow me, I'll take over for a while.
Please go ahead.
Sanjeev and Atul, thank you for that discussion. Sanjeev, I must compliment you. I mean, I know how brilliant you are in understanding economy and explaining it. For anyone who's a beginner, like Atul said, his mother is not an economist. She could understand, I could understand, I'm not an economist. And I could appreciate, not only you started off with the coconut example and went to deregulation, and in 30 minutes you were from the basics to the nitty gritty, and that is great. I mean, absolutely very brilliant of you, Sanjeev. I must say two things. One is that I agree with you totally on the deregulation part, and the government has to deregulate a lot of things it does. The government has no business to be in things like tourism and hotels and lots of other industrial activities which it does. And I, being an administrator, a former administrator, always favor the government's role to be one of a facilitator. And, it's there for you if you need the government, but doesn't intervene overly, doesn't get into your face. And you shouldn't be thinking about the government when you're going about your business. And the government should be there. I mean, that is how the country should function, as you rightly said. The second thing I really, really agreed with you is that the package of 20 lakh crore rupees is humongous. And it has to have come from somewhere. Someone has to pay for it. And if the taxpayers are paying for it, then somebody's going to feel the pinch. So I wonder if I think the local to global kind of regime might be better than just local. The globalization benefits were there for all to see. My third agreement with you is in the terms of leadership. You mentioned it obliquely, and Atul mentioned it obliquely, with coalition governments and totalitarian regimes being on the other end. I think a question of leadership is what really drives countries and economies, allowing people to do what they do best. And we lack, unfortunately, global leadership at this point of time, which could have taken us forward despite COVID or despite hiccups. So my ideas and yours pretty much gel with each other. Sanjeev, having said that, we have a few questions, so I'm going to quickly bounce them off you. Okay. I think we have about 10 minutes for about 6 questions. So accordingly, you can economize your answers.
Okay.
Take them from there. The first is, what steps should be immediately taken post-COVID-19 by the Indian economy? Apart from the package, what should they do?
Well, I've always been an advocate of one strategy, okay? You have to get the NPAs off the books of commercial banks, okay? The RBI has to print money and buy all the NPAs, existing NPAs from commercial banks. So the balance sheet of commercial banks should be clean and they can start lending again. Let the commercial banks go back to the business of what they do best, which is lend money. Let not the government decide who should get money and how much and what rate and this and that. That's a little bit of an overreach, I think, okay? And secondly, there is a risk in printing money. Okay, there is always a risk of inflation, and the risk is if the supply side doesn't come up, and there's a lot of money chasing a few goods. A lot of money chasing few goods causes inflation. But the other risk is even more dangerous, which is the risk of deflation. So if you don't have enough money going into the economy, the spending power of Indians is going to go down and the prices are going to go down, which is going to cause deflation. And both deflation and inflation are real risks, and they're equally, the probability of each of them is equal right now. So I wish the government had come out and said, okay, like they did in the U.S., the quantitative easing in the U.S., the reserve, the Federal Reserve of the United States bought all the bad loans, bad housing loans, in 2008. The Bank of Japan did that post World War II. Post World War II, none of the Japanese banks had any liquidity. All their loans were bad loans. The Bank of Japan bought all those bad loans at face value and kept them on their balance sheet. Now, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet is not as important as the balance sheet of a commercial bank, because the Reserve Bank of India does not have to lend to the consumer. So their balance sheet is not as critical as the balance sheet of a commercial bank. So that's the first thing the government should do. Instead of putting money into the economy directly, they should have channeled the money through the commercial banks, bought the loans, and let the commercial banks then lend out the money.
Right.
Secondly, I think the government needs to, if it wants to prioritize something, it needs to seriously come up with a list of things, sectors that India could have a competitive advantage in, and I'm not sure the government is doing that. They're focusing more on yes, employment is important, but employment is a second order effect. Okay, employment comes from a good factory producing goods and services that the rest of the world wants. There is no point pumping money into a factory which is producing bananas when the rest of the world wants apples. Okay, so if we pump money into industries which produces goods and services that the rest of the world wants, the employment would follow automatically. But the focus right now is to generate employment, and I think that's a little bit of a policy mistake, so there is really no simple cure. Okay, it's like putting a choke on a motorcycle. You need to put extra gas into the economy. We need to put capital into the economy. Okay, and there's only two ways to do it. Either you borrow the money or you print new money. Okay, unfortunately, we can't borrow too much money. So the only other option left is to print money. Now, if you looked at the speech the finance minister gave yesterday, the government is not really giving money to the MSMEs. They're actually just providing a guarantee to the bank. The bank is the one that's lending the money to the MSME, and the government is providing a guarantee. So there is really no outlay from the government side. Okay, simply a guarantee. In the United States, on the other hand, the Federal Reserve actually sent checks to small businesses so that they can use that to pay their employees and keep people employed and so on and so forth. So, and again, I think for Mr. Modi to enunciate a policy of localization, I mean, we have such stark examples that import substitution doesn't work. I mean, look at India and Singapore. Both got independence around the same time, India 47, Singapore 51. India followed import substitution. That was Nehru's big thing. Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore followed a policy of openness. Look where Singapore is today, look where India is today. For us to go back to a policy of import substitution and to ignore the advantages of trade, I think is a huge mistake. And to do it at a time like this is, I think, a very critical mistake.
Right, Sanjeev, got your point. We have something related to the ratchet effect, which I have no idea what it's about. Mr. Amar Rao, he says, do you think this huge package is going to lead to the ratchet effect? And the second question is it in some ways this package going to help increase India's GDP? Two different people.
Well, see, the second one is very easy to answer. It's called the broken window fallacy. Okay, you break a window and then you fix it, and then you put money into the economy. You think that GDP is going to go up. No, you've taken 20 lakhs out of the economy and put it back into some sectors of the economy. Is now going to cause GDP to go up. Now, obviously, GDP next year will be higher than the GDP this year, because this year GDP is going to be negative. But that's no big shakes. Okay, the opportunity cost of this lost capital is huge. So I'm not sure that is just a myth. The ratchet effect, on the other hand, yes, the economy will get better when money comes into the hands of people. The question, though, is I don't know how much money is coming into the hands of people. Some of the money that's coming in is the refund that's owed to them in taxes, which is really their money. I mean, it's not a stimulus by the government; it's their money that they've already budgeted into their family budgets. So I'm not sure how much new money is being pumped into the economy. And whether there's going to be a ratchet effect or not, I don't know. I do know one thing. I read a statistic yesterday in a survey done by the CMI. They found that 35% of the families have 1 week's worth of money left before they go broke. 35, one out of every 3 families in India is going to go broke in a week. Now, when they go broke, they're not worried about COVID at that point. They're more worried about survival. So that's a huge risk. 80% of the people said they have less money today than they had 3 months ago. These are real risks that have to be factored in. So ratchet, the hockey stick effect that this gentleman is talking about, a lady's talking about, is in my mind a little bit of a stretch.
I have one more question here, Sanjeev. So the informal economy, the economy which is not regulated, which is not the salaried class. I think the small-time businessman, the shopkeeper, they said that 1 in 5 are going to absolutely close down. Mm-hmm. So what is the way to get the unorganized sector back on track?
Like I said, Vivek, there's only one way, okay? Increase the number of transactions, which is pump capital money into the system, okay? New money, not just recycling old money by giving tax refunds early. That is not new money. That is just old money that's in the system that's being recycled back, or government giving guarantees on loans. That is not new money coming into the system. What the government should have done was clearly announced, said, look, we are going to create new money either by printing or by borrowing, and this is how much we want to pump into the economy. And X, Y, and Z is going to get this much, and private sectors and small businesses are going to get this much. The poor people are going to get this much, and figured out a way to do that much earlier than now. Okay, the patient is really sick. You don't roll him into the hospital when he's about to die. The lockdown was announced on March the 24th, and today is what? Today's May the whatever. It's almost 2 months. So this should have been done a long time ago.
Right.
Timing is very. Once a business shuts down, it's very, very hard to restart it. So it's better to stop the shutting down of the business than having to try to restart it. So the hockey stick effect that the gentleman is talking about happens only if you can save the business from going under. But once it's already gone under, it's very hard to restart it.
So I think it's been a fascinating discussion, almost coming to an end. We'll pick up one more question, which I'll try to answer. And excuse me if I'm getting it wrong, Sanjeev. I'm not a blue-blooded economist like you.
You might get it right.
Right, I might get it right. So Nisha Kapoor is asking, are we getting into economic recession? And Nisha, I've done some numbers over here. I've been a very keen follower of economics, while I'm not a PhD like possibly you or Sanjeev. And my estimates are that the Indian economy will shrink by anywhere between 7 to 10%. I again repeat, the economy will shrink by 7 to 10% this financial year. That's a huge shift from the 3 or 4% growth that we were expecting earlier pre-COVID. I also believe, and I like Sanjeev's views, whether first of all he agrees with me or not, but I also believe that the blue-blooded economists have not so far had the courage to speak the truth. No one is talking about this huge recession that is looming ahead of us, whether it's in India or the world, and it's only in whispers that we're talking about it. All economists across the world are possibly talking about a 0, -2, +2 type of a scenario across the world. But I, again, would like to mention that I think it's going to be way, way, way worse. These are my estimates, not Shoolini's. So don't hold Shoolini for it, but hold me for it. But I'd love to hear Sanjeev, his thoughts on what's going to happen and how do you see the next 12 months?
Well, on an annual basis, you may be right. Between April of 2020 and April of 2021, the economy may shrink by between 5 and 7%. It's hard to say. If you shut down for 2 months, that's 1/6 of a year. All right, that's 16% of your GDP already gone. Okay, that's a significant amount of loss. Okay, so it's not going to be easy. So yes, there is going to be a recession. The problem is that we've never had a recession in India for the last 40 years. We don't know how to fight a recession. The US has a recession every 8 years, because it's a capital-driven economy driven by free markets. So they have this sort of the cyclical approach to recessions and and prosperity. In India, we've not had a recession. We have no idea how to fight a recession. I wish the Modi government would hire the best economists in the world and let's say, guys, let's go to work. Instead of trying to rely on a small coterie of people who've never seen a recession, don't even know how to handle one. And it's going to be tough. It's going to be tough. Something will have to be done drastically different. To see that there'll be reforms done now after post-COVID is, to me, absolutely shocking. Why do we need a pandemic to have reforms? I mean, it's pretty obvious to anybody looking at the data that the reforms done in 1991 worked, but they stopped working after 2010. And so we need reform 2.0 now. We need a new set of reforms. And what needs to be happening at the top policy levels is a serious discussion of reforms and policy changes and announcing them to the world. Signaling is the most important thing I've learned as a capital markets expert. Signaling is the most important thing. The government doesn't have to do much. It has to signal its intent and do it very clearly. And the global capital will come to India. There's plenty of capital in the world. The capital in the world is not gone anywhere. It's there. It'll come to India if the government signals a clear intent and a clear set of principles.
Super. Last thoughts, Vivek. Anything from you?
Wonderful.
You've been a keen follower.
I am in agreement with Sanjeev. It's time. It was time earlier. It's not time now. But now the damage has been done. We need to get our heads together and formulate strategies which work. I totally agree on the global to local connect. And I love the example of two options in the 70s, Yesdi and Bullet. 777 was the Coke we had.
Yeah, 777 Coke, yeah. And thumbs up, yes. Yeah,
I think the 70s was probably a very dark hour in our country's economy. They made the worst decisions, whether it was the Congress or the Janata Dal or whatever. And so now we have a chance to actually move forward instead of back. You said that China has lost credibility, whatever it had. India needs to capitalize in many ways at the global level. There's a lot of investment available. We need to improve our ease of doing business. We need to make regulations easier and encourage the free market. Absolutely, I agree.
Yeah, foreign companies will not invest in India if the Prime Minister of the country says we will only buy local products. I mean, it just is not happening, and we need capital right now, desperately need capital.
He said it in Hindi, Sanjeev, and he said it in good Hindi, so nobody else could understand.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to end this discussion on a slightly more optimist note. I'm a diehard optimist on the Indian economy. A very dear Dutch friend of mine, a senior partner with McKinsey, once put it in beautiful words. He said, India is the Diego Maradona of the world economic. I again repeat, India is the Diego Maradona of world economics. Utterly abused, yet a world beater. So hopefully we will become a world beater. We will continue to be a world beater. The only last thought I'll have for all of you on this panel discussion, on this webinar, is that the future of India lies in your hands. You are the ones who are going to climb up the tree to produce the coconuts. So the harder you work, the more innovatively you work, the more India is going to grow. So I think we'll figure out the way. I think we'll figure out the interpretation of local in a different way. I think there are some very, very smart people around in India, and hopefully we will not see the recession that we predict, and we will overcome that and become a great nation, a nation that we deserve to be. Once again, thank you very much, Sanjeev. It's been a phenomenal, a brilliant, and a very exciting talk, and we have to get you back again because I have to hear more views from you, and I'm sure so does our audience. Vivek, as always, so charming, always smiling, and so insightful. And participants, thank you for your wonderful questions. Amar, you've been brilliant today. You've been writing a lot on the chat, and would love to also have a chat with you later on economics. Have a great day, be safe, and see you tomorrow again, 11:30 on the Yogananda Guru series. And this time we'll move from economics into manufacturing, where our dear friend Saideep, who's also a grandson of the very famous Vishwakarma, is going to speak about how do we enhance manufacturing in the country. Thank you once again and have a great day. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.